All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shurman Drashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar Habalin of Tova Shmuel and Rabbi Karapkin, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shmuel's father, Leonard Karapkin Lipa ben Yecheskel HaKohen Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah, the family in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, shall allow our holy soldiers to be successful. And of course, on this day of Yom HaZikaron, we remember the tremendous price that Klal Yisrael has paid. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, over 25,000 precious soldiers, victims of terror, who have given their lives, Akidushas Hashem Ha'am Va'aretz. You know, when a little boy comes into this world and he has his bris, so we say to him a fascinating phrase. We say to him, Va'amar lach b'damayich chayi, Va'amar lach b'damayich chayi. We will tell you that through your blood you will live. And it's such a strange thing to say. Welcome to the Jewish people, right? B'damayich chayi, you will live with your blood, or through your blood. But the truth is, one of the realities that we know as a people is that anything that we want, and anything that we want to hold on to, and anything that we want to achieve, only comes through tremendous self-sacrifice. Yom HaZikaron is about the power of the self-sacrifice of Klal Yisrael. That what we will do for each other, and what we will do for our people, and what we will do for our land, knows absolutely no limitations. And to think that, I think up until October 7th, for so many of us, Yom HaZikaron was something that really reflected a historical event, or historical events, reflected perhaps people, individual losses here and there. And all of that changed since the start of this war, where we have seen so many precious, young, idealistic, committed soldiers willing to run into battle, willing to run to the fight, willing to go ahead and literally put everything on the line. Why? For you, for me, for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, for Torah, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, religious, not religious, all kinds of different people, just willing to sacrifice everything for Jewish eternality, for Jewish destiny. That's Yom HaZikaron. That's Yom HaZikaron. So it behooves us on this day, whatever it is, we speak of this every year, whatever it is that we bring, with our particular political or hashkafic ideas or associations, so much of that is just simply irrelevant. Yom HaZikaron is a day in which we remember that we live in times where young men and women, victims of terror, all of them are willing to give their lives for us, for Am Yisrael. And that requires us to have tremendous hakaras hatov. And that requires us to make sure that their sacrifice is worthwhile, that we are maximizing our opportunities, our lives, given the fact that they were willing to pay the ultimate price to sustain that and preserve that for us. So we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, their precious neshama Shavna Aliyah, in the merit of our Talmud Torah, merit Hashem, as we mentioned before, our holy soldiers should be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedayim. In the merit of our Torah, merit Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu should shower Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael with a sense of peace. And remember, on this day, when you go, if you've ever been in Eretz Yisrael for Yom HaZikaron, it's like the pasuk says, "Ein bayis asher ein shames." Everyone has a chilek in this day. Everyone has a chilek, whether it's an immediate relative, an extended relative. Everyone's going to the cemetery for someone. Everyone's going to the cemetery for someone. And it's important for us just to be able to participate, at least emotionally, spiritually, in that sacrifice. So we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the precious Neshama Shavna Aliyah, in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Halavai Meretz Hashem, Shira Malas B'Shuv Hashem Hashiva Sinayinu Kecholmim. All of the loss, Mashiach comes, Chazal tell us that all of the losses will be like a dream. All of the losses, all of the pain will simply evaporate. And Halavai, we should be Zochei Meretz Hashem to see that day. Meher Rabbi Yameinu. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Chaf Beis 22. We are picking up Emiras Hashem on Chaf Aleph on the base 21b, and we left off literally at the Gemara. So Amar Abimi Bar Amar Yosef, Poshet Velovesh, Poshet Velovesh, Lovesh Mamish, Afilu Maknis Umotzi Beis Yad Unkali Shalo. Shabbos say when we speak about the idea that if you are shatnez the entire day and receive multiple warnings that you could be chayiv for every individual act of wearing shatnez, the Gemara asks a very interesting question. How do you define an act of wearing shatnez? So obviously, if I put on shatnez, take it off, get warned, put it back on, take it off, get warned, put it back on, obviously, each of those acts are going to be separate individual acts of wearing shatnez, and therefore there will be liability. Here's the other question. What happens if I don't fully take off the garment? Let's say I just remove my sleeve, right? I just take my arm out of the sleeve, and then again, get asra, put my arm back into the sleeve. So the majority of the beged is still remaining on me, but I'm doing an act of removal, and then an act of donning. Does that count to create individuated liability or not? The Gemara gives a fascinating answer. The Gemara says, Machli Rav Acha Berei Rav Ika Iluye Va'afuke. So Rav Acha Berei Rav Ika said, no, it's got to be taking off and putting on. In other words, if you're keeping the garment on, even if you're just slipping out a sleeve, at the end of the day, that's still called wearing, and therefore there can't be individuated liability for a consistent act of wearing. So therefore it has to be you're removing the garment and putting it back on. Rav Asher, not necessarily. Afilu lo shah ela kedei lifshot v'lil bo shchayiv. So this is actually quite fascinating. So Rav Ashi responds. Rav Ashi says, not true. Halacha l'maaseh, even if you never physically took off the garment, but rather again, if you did this, you got hasra, you put on the garment, right? So obviously, again, there's liability. Let's say then Eidim come along and they say, by the way, you're not allowed to wear shatnez, and I still keep the shatnez on. I still keep the shatnez on for the amount of time that it would have taken to take off and put back on the garment. There's additional liability for that as well. So we'll say this is quite dramatic. So Rav Ashi does not require, in order to remember, we're looking to see how do you create a case of individuated liability for a sustained act of shatnez wearing. Right, of shatnez, we're looking to find out. So the simplest idea would be you put on, you take off, you put on, you take off with separate hasra before each. Rav Ashi says even if you keep it on, but he didn't consistently show up and say, by the way, you're not allowed to wear shatnez. If you wear shatnez, you chayiv malchus, and I still, after that warning, keep the garment on long enough for the amount of time to have taken it off and put it back on. There's liability for that as well, individuated liability for that as well. Quite amazing. All right, let's go weiter. Yesh chorish shalom. So then Rabbi say we got to this interesting part of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said for one act of plowing, you could be chayiv for 8 different lavim, 8 different prohibitions, and then the Mishnah went through those different prohibitions. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yanai, bechabura nimnu, in our chabura, nimnu v'gamru. It was decided. Now Rashi points out to her, what's this chabura? Rashi says in the third wide line, nira li, Yom asifa o yom vad hayalahem shekorin chabura. This chabura was more like a yarchikala, where they learned, right? In other words, right? So it was a yarchikala. It was where they got together. They got together for a day, right? Rashi says it's very interesting. Yom asifa, a day of gathering. O Yom Vad, a day of gathering where again they got together to discuss issues, and they will say, and they decided the following idea: Hacholfe bekilayim loge, that if one covers kilayim, you're loge. I will say, now what does this mean? What's the classic case of planting kilayim? Right, classic case of planting kilayim. You take 2 dissimilar seeds, right? What do? You dig a hole in the ground, you put it in the ground, and then you cover it. That's kilayim. That's kilayim. Okay. So I'll say, so what about, let's say again, if the seeds are already in the ground? Let's say they're already there. And then what? I come along and I cover the seeds. So I did not put them in the ground, but I covered them. Is there liability for that? So the Gemara Rabbi Yanai says, we decided in the Chabura that even going ahead and covering the seeds is kilayim, you get malchus. Amar lehem Rabbi Yochanan, lav mishnah seinu hizo. Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, Rabbi Yanai, calm down. It's not such a big chiddush. That's our mishnah. That's our Mishnah, right? What did the Mishnah say? Listen to this. Yesh choresh, because now it goes to the Mishnah's case. Yesh choresh talam echad v'chayav ala mishum shmona lavin. Sometimes you could plow one furrow and be liable for 8 different lavin. What are they? What are the 8 lavin? Hachorish b'shar b'chamar, right? I'm plowing with an ox and a donkey, so that's again kilayim of animals. Vehein mukdash, and they're consecrated. Ukilayim bakerem. And again, I'm planting a forbidden mixture. So the Gemara says, by the way, what's the case, ultimately, again, of plowing, which makes you liable to kilayim? It must be that what's really happening over here is that as I'm bringing the animals with the plow is actually covering the seeds with dirt, right? Because if you think about it, you can't plow and violate kilayim, right? The act of kilayim is planting forbidden mixtures. Plowing is going ahead and making a hole in the ground. So how could I plow and violate kilayim? What's the answer? The answer is if I'm as I am leading the animals, which are pulling the plow. Ultimately, again, the dirt covers the seeds. Then that's going to be an active kilayim. So what do you see from here? That even covering seeds, ultimately, again, is kilayim. So this is Rabbi Yochanan says. Amalei, so this is great. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan, okay, shkoyach, ilav didiloi lecha chasba mimeshka. I'm sorry, idloi didiloi lecha chasba mimeshkachas maganisa to say. This is a great expression. So Rabbi Yochanan says back to Rabbi Yochanan, had I not lifted up the shard, would you have discovered the jewel? In other words, remember the discussion over here? Rabbi Yochanan says we decided in the Chabura that even if you cover up kilayim, ultimately, again, you're going to be liable. You're going to be liable for kilayim. Rabbi Yochanan says that's not such a chiddush. It's in the Mishnah. It's in the Mishnah. That's the case of plowing where you're liable to kilayim. To which Rabbi Yochanan said the only reason you're interpreting it that way is because of my statement. Had it not been for my statement, you would not have known. You would not have known that particular reality. They will say it's such a great line. The Gemara says, right? So had I not removed the pottery shard, you would have never found the jewel. They will say so many times in life we accomplish things, we see things, we discover things, we understand things, and we often think it's our own accomplishment. What we sometimes fail to recognize and fail to realize is that the accomplishments of the present are only due to the Mesiras Nefesh and to the sacrifices of the past. Only because someone came before me and lifted up a pottery shard do I have the ability to discover the jewel. And I will say again, we just spoke a few moments ago about Yom HaZikaron, this idea that, you think about, sometimes we see all of the machlokes that happens in Eretz Yisrael. Right, all of the machlokes, and again, sometimes it's hard to know from the news. What's real and what's not. In general, whenever you follow the news, you think that the sky is falling. But when you go ahead and you sometimes look at the news out of Eretz Yisrael, and it feels like Chas v'Shalom lo alinu Rahman al-Islam sinas chinam is going ahead and rearing its ugly head. Right, and just today, if everyone's following the news, they evacuated 5 communities along Route 1. Route 1 is closed today, and I saw by Yerushalayim because of the wildfires that are burning. And it's almost like sometimes like the Rebbeinu Shalom sends us these messages that there are too many fires burning in Eretz Yisrael. There's too many fires. And not talking about Hamas, not talking about Hezbollah, not talking about the Houthis. No one ever even heard of the Houthis. I still can't figure out who the Houthis are. Right? Right? It's not those fires. Like you should have to be someone significant to start up with the Jewish people, right? You can't be some guys with just a bunch of towels and just, whatever. You should have to. Anyway, so there's so many, not those fires. There are too many fires inside of Klal Yisrael. Too many fires inside of Klal Yisrael. And it's almost as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sending us this message that extinguish the fires. Extinguish the fires because you're taking for granted what you have. Eretz Yisrael, what we have in Am Yisrael today is such a pearl. Why do we have the pearl? Because those who came before us, so many of those for whom we mourn on Yom HaZikaron, came and removed the pottery shard. So they worked hard to remove the shard so we could enjoy the pearl. And too often we squander the pearl with so much infighting and so much unnecessary machlokes. But in life in general, I will say, it's good to think about the pearls you have in life. Who are the people who removed the shard so you could enjoy what you have? Who are the people in your life who have sacrificed, who have given, who have worked, so that you could enjoy the brachos that you benefit from? Sometimes we just see the problem like, oh, look what I found. No, you didn't find it. No, you didn't make it. No, you didn't discover it. Someone else in your life, either someone alongside you or someone before you or someone generations before you, worked hard to remove that shard so you could see the beautiful luminescent brachos that you have in your life. Overwhelming. The Gemara goes weiter. Ilav de Kilsach Gavra Rabba. So listen to this. So Rish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, had not, though he praised as a great man, have Amina Masnis in money. I would say, who does our Mishnah, whose opinion does our Mishnah really reflect? Rabbi Akiva. This is fascinating. What does Rabbi Akiva say? Da'amar Hamekayim Kilayim Loke. Rabbi Akiva says, this is fascinating. Both say, so remember, how did we start today? Rabbi Yana came along and said that even if you just cover Kilayim with dirt, you are chayiv. Now, both say, so just understand the chiddush in that, right? Before Rabbi Yochanan, I would have thought, or before Rabbi Yana, excuse me, I would have thought that halacha l'maisa, or Rabbi Yochanan also, I would have thought that in order to violate kilayim, what do you need to do? What do you need to do? You need to plant it, right? So comes along Rabbi Yana, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, even if you just cover it with dirt. The Gemara says, the truth is, had we not had this discussion, I would have actually thought that our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva goes a step further. Rabbi Akiva says, even sustaining kilayim, there's liability. Now, what does that mean, sustaining kilayim? I have a field. It turns out that kilayim is growing in the field. So I don't do anything about it. I leave it there. I don't uproot it. Rabbi Akiva says, there's liability for that as well. Liability, in other words, liability even just for sustaining the existence of kilayim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, where do you see that? Tisanya, haminachish v'hamachape bekilayim loka. So again, if one weeds around kilayim, again, remember, what does weeding do? Facilitates growth. So if there's kilayim growing and I weed around the kilayim, so as to facilitate the growth of the kilayim, or menachish, mechape, or I go ahead and cover the seeds. Loka, you get Makkos, that's called planting kilayim. Rabbi Akiva says, af ha-mekayim. Rabbi Akiva says, even if you just sustain, i.e., fail to remove kilayim, there's liability for that as well. The Gemara goes to my time with Rabbi Akiva. What's Rabbi Akiva's logic? The Sanya, sadcha lo sizra kilayim. The pasuk says, do not go ahead and plant your field kilayim. Ainli ela zoreya. I only know that the prohibition is to seed, is to actually plant. It's to plant. So the Gemara says, Mekayim, I don't know that even sustaining kilayim is biblically problematic. Tamalomar, kilayim sadcha. So I will say, so it's interesting. Rabbi Akiva notes the juxtaposition of two words, even though, again, the pasuk is not really read this way, right? The pasuk is read, right? The Gemara says, sadcha lo sizra kilayim. Ubegid kilayim shanis. So right, it's really 3 kilayim. Don't intermix animals. Don't go ahead and intermix seeds, and don't go ahead and wear wool and linen together. But it's interesting because there's a juxtaposition of two words of kilayim sadcha. Even though that's not how it's read, Rabbi Akiva knows the juxtaposition. Kilayim sadcha means there can't be kilayim in your field, meaning don't even sustain kilayim, because sustaining kilayim by definition is the biblical prohibition. Incredible. So okay, so what says fine. So therefore, just this is an important nugget of information. Just halacha l'maisa, again, not only am I liable, and this is halacha l'maisa, not only am I liable ultimately for actively planting kilayim, I'm even liable for covering kilayim seeds with dirt. And again, Rabbi Akiva goes so far to say that I'm even liable for going ahead and sustaining it and failing to remove it. Incredible. Let's go back there. So the Gemara says, Amar le Ra'ula l'Rab Nachman. So says Rab Nachman, why stop at 8 levels of liability in the case of the Mishnah? There's additional levels of liability. What are they? So the Gemara says, Lilkin Ami Mishum Zorea B'Yom Tov. Why don't you go ahead? Remember, why not go ahead and also set this up as a case where when is all of this happening? It's happening, right? It's for seeding for seeding on Yom Tov. Amalei Tana V'Shir says, you're right. You could add that one in also, but the Tana didn't include every single liability. It was just giving a lot of examples of joint liability. Amalei Tana Katani Shwana Va'at Amr Tana V'Shir. You can't say that. See, Rabbi say, if the Mishnah would have said you could do one act and be liable multiple times, that's one thing. When the Tana gives a number, once you give a number, what a number indicates is what? What a number indicates is that halacha l'maisa, is that halacha l'maisa, that's a specific list. So once it's a specific list, that would seem to say whatever is included, whatever is excluded is excluded. Rava, yesh chilik malachas b'Shabbos, bein chilik malachas b'Yom Tov. Here's the difference, Rava says. There is a distinction of liability. In other words, you could be chayiv for multiple malachas done at once on Shabbos, but that concept does not apply on Yom Tov. So on Yom Tov, if a person, let's say, gets, when one helam and one lapse of awareness does multiple things, there's only one liability. Or for that matter, again, does the same act multiple times, only one act of liability. But by Shabbos, that's different. So therefore, by Yom Tov, you can't be chayiv for both choresh and zoreah, for both plowing and seeding at one moment. Okay, Rashi says over here, if you look at Rashi, it's about 5 lines up from the bottom. Vein chilik malachas b'Yom Tov, im asa shtayim v'shalosh malachas behelam echad, o asa malacha sheyesh b'shtayim eno chayiv ela achas. So this is an interesting idea in general. Again, we're not getting into all the halachic distinctions, but Shabbos has chilik malachas, Yom Tov does not have chilik malachos. Okay, so the Gemara says, Eisvei Abai, is that true? Vein chilik malachas b'Yom Tov, is that true that you can't be liable for multiple liabilities, for multiple malachas on Yom Tov, done in one lapse? Is that true? Now we learned Hamavashal Gid B'chala B'Yom Tov. If a person goes ahead and cooks the Gid Hanasha in milk on Yom Tov, and then eats it, V'achlo, and then you eat it, Lo Kechamish, ultimately you get 5 sets of malchus. What do you get malchus for? So Lo Kemishum Ochel Gid. So number one, you've gone ahead and you get malchus for eating Gid Hanasha, right? Number 2, V'lo Kemishum Mevashal B'Yom Tov, right? Shelo L'tzorech. You get malchus for cooking on Yom Tov for non-ochel nefesh purposes, right? In other words, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov if you're for ochel nefesh, but cooking something that is prohibited for consumption is illegal on Yom Tov. So you're going to get malchus for going ahead and eating Gid Hanasha, right? Malchus for cooking on Yom Tov in an illegal way. Lo Kemishum Mevashal Gid B'chalav, Basar B'chalav, right? And remember again, there's liability even for cooking basar b'chalav. V'lo mishum ochel basar b'chalav, then you'll get malchus for eating basar b'chalav. V'lo at top of chav beis mishum havara. You'll also get malchus for havara, for kindling. Remember, now technically speaking, one is allowed to kindle on Yom Tov, technically, as long as it is litzorech ochel nefesh. But because once again, this is not ochel nefesh, because this entire act of consumption is illegal, therefore there's liability. I says the Yimar Vim Isa. Mishum havar lo mechayev, deha echayev le mishum bishulo. So we're saying, well, 1 second, you just said that on Yom Tov, you can't have multiple liabilities for one act. So if that's the case, I can't be chayev for both havara and for bishul. Right? So the Gemara says, you're right, apik havara va'ayil gid hanasha shal nevela. You're right, take out havara, and instead put in liability for Gid Hanasha of Nevela. But Rabbi Chia said you get 2 acts of malchus for consumption. Right, 1 for Gid Hanasha, 1 for Basar B'chalav. Ushalosh al bishulo, and 3 malchus for the actual bishul itself, which would seem to indicate that there's liability both for bishul and havara, which would then mean that there is multiple sets of liability for one act, even on Yom Tov. Vim isa shalosh al achilasa hu chayiv el apik havara va'ayil atse ashera. See, right, the Gemara says take out havara and instead put in there Asya Asherah. What would be the case? The case is where I'm using wood of an Asherah to fuel the fire. So therefore, again, that would be use of Avodah Zarah, ultimately, again, for liability as well. Okay, the Azhara Semihacha. And ultimately, again, in the Azhara, the warning would be from here, Lo Yitbak Biyad Chamuma. Okay, fine. So we'll say, so that takes care of that. So we'll say, we're back, the Gemara is going to ask a series of questions that are all the same basic question, which is, why does the Mishnah's case, right? Why limit it to 8 acts of liability? After I could give you so many other forms of liability that could create additional liability. So we'll say, so what about the following idea? Why not go ahead and get malchus? Ultimately, again, for this prohibition, do not bring an abomination to your home. Ella hacha ma'askin. What's the case over here? The case we're dealing with over here is we're actually no. The cooking wasn't done. I'm sorry, we're not finished the Yom Tov case. The cooking wasn't done with wood of Asherah. Rather, it was done with wood of hegdish. Okay, sorry, this is still back in the Yom Tov case. I apologize. And the warning is from here. Okay, fine. So if I will say again, what comes out of here is that halacha l'maisa again. So first of all, a number of different halachas when it comes to kilayim. Those are the halachas we just saw, and also apparently when it comes to Shabbos, there could be multiple levels of liability for multiple acts, what we call chilik malachas. Even if you perform multiple acts in one helam, one lapse of awareness, there could be individuated liability, but no chilik malachas by Yom Tov. Okay, incredible. Let's go weiter. So now we're back to the Mishnah's case, where the Mishnah said you could do one act of plowing, and be liable 8 different times. The Gemara now is just simply going to ask, the Gemara is going to say, why not add on additional prohibitions over here? So for example, the Gemara says, Maska Roshia, Velech Nami, Hazorea Benachal Esan. It's very interesting. I could add on a 9th. What's the 9th? Where this act, the Mishnah, what's the Mishnah's case, right? I'm plowing with an ox and a donkey, Hegai. Let's add on a 9th. Where's the plowing taking place? Nachal Esan. What's Nachal Esan? That's the dry riverbed where you do Egla Arufa. What's the halacha there, Rabbi saying? What's the halacha? The halacha is ultimately, again, the halacha is that if you're not allowed to plow in that area, you're forever supposed to leave it barren. So let's say now the plowing itself is taking place in Nachal Esan, another liability. The warning would be from here. Asher lo yavad ba v'lo yizoreh. I'll give you another case. Let's say someone had the name of Hashem written, and I ended up going ahead and erasing that name of Hashem with my plow as I pulled it. So as I'm plowing, I chas v'shalom erased the name of Hashem. Another liability. And again, the warning against erasing the name of Hashem is from the following pasuk. V'ibadatem es shemam by avodah zarah. You shall destroy the name of idolatry. Lo tasun kain laHashem elokechem. Do not do the same to Hashem your God. So we're just trying to figure out how you can add on additional levels of liability to this plowing case. So let's say as I'm plowing, I also go ahead and remove my tzaras lesion, which is a biblical prohibition. He shamar beneged tzaras. Maskif la'abayis. Abayis is another kasha. Velech shov nami. This is interesting. Hamaziach hachoshen me'al ha'efod v'hamasir badei aron. Let's say, imagine. Remember, in the case of the Mishnah, the guy in question was a Kohen. Let's take it up a notch. Let's say he was a Kohen Gadol. And what did he do? He went ahead and he was wearing the big day kahuna, and while plowing, Rashi actually has a different discussion over here. While plowing, before plowing, after plowing, the point is during the plowing, he moved the choshen. The choshen is the breastplate. He moved the choshen from the apron. The halacha is that the choshen itself is attached to the apron of the Kohen Gadol. There's a biblical prohibition to move the choshen. Let's say he did so. Or he removed the poles of the aron and used those in the plowing process. That's bad, right? The point over here, Abba says, we're just trying to show how you can add on additional layers of liability beyond the 8. The Mishnah makes it sound like 8 is the maximum. The Gemara is just trying to show, obviously, again, these are exaggerated cases, but the Gemara is just trying to make a point that Allah Chalamaisi, you could add on additional layers of liability should you choose to do so. Lo yasuru v'lo yizach hachoshen. Maskif l'Ravashi v'lech shov nami hachoresh ba'atzei ashera. Let's add on another example, right? One is plowing ultimately again with atzei ashera, the wood of an ashera tree. In other words, let's say my plow is made out of ashera. So I'm using avodah zarah in the actual plowing of the field. Lo yidbak biyadcha mu'uma. Let's add another one. Let's say in the act of plowing, I end up cutting down perfectly good fruit trees, or for that matter, perfectly healthy other trees. Okay, Amrali Rabbi Zira. So the Rabbi money. Sorry, Amrali Rabbi Zira Rabbi money. The Lakshav Nami. I'll add another one. Kigon Shvur Shelo Achrosh B'Yom Tov. I'll say, let's say again, this guy in question. So again, I'll say, all we're trying to show is how you can add on even more prohibitions. So here, Rabbi Zeira says something interesting to Rabbi Money. Imagine the following scenario. Maybe we're talking about a guy who made an oath. He made a shvuah. It's coming attractions in Meretz Hashem b'Shal Tov Mitzlachos. He made a shvuah. He swore, I will not plow on Yom Tov. Then when he ends up plowing on Yom Tov, in addition to all the other levels of liability, what else has he done? He's transgressed his shvuah, not a liability. So Yisrael says, no, that's not a good one. I'll tell you. I hasam lo kachala shvuah mushpa va'omei mehar Sinaihu. That shvuah actually does not work. Why doesn't that shvuah work? Rabbi said there's a concept of mushva va'omed. Mushva va'omed means, and we'll get into this in Masechah Shvuos, if you are already obligated to do something, ultimately, again, an additional shvuah does not devolve upon that act. Like, for example, let's say a person swears, I'm going to put on tefillin this morning. So we'll see, according to this approach, that shvuah is inconsequential. Why? I'm already obligated to do so. That's called mushva va'omed. I'm already obligated to do so. So therefore, taking an oath that I won't plow on Yom Tov and then plowing on Yom Tov, I'm liable for a lot of things. I'm not liable for violation of the oath. Why not? Because I'm already adjured. So I'm already obligated to not plow on Yom Tov. So that shvuah is inconsequential. Amarle, ki go into Amar, it's very interesting. We'll say first white line, ki go into Amar, shvuah shelo achrosh bein b'chol bein Yom Tov, temigo dechal alei shvuah b'chol, chal alei nami b'Yom Tov. So we'll say, so again, this is already treading into shvuah sugyas. So now what's the case? The case is where I swore I'm not going to plow during the week and on Yom Tov as well. Now we'll say, now there's a concept we'll see in shvuahs that since the shvuah is chal on the weekday component, it's also chal on the Yom Tov component. Okay, so the Gemara again we'll see all of the mechanics of that when we get to shvuahs. To which the Gemara says, no. Midi di isi b'sheila lo katani. No, the Gemara says we're not including anything ultimately again that could be. That ultimately, again, can have she'ela. She'ela means that you can have it revoked. So therefore, again, or annulled, I should say. You could have it annulled. So any prohibition that could be annulled is not included in this list. So really, is that true? V'lo v'hari hekdesh. But hekdesh could be annulled. Right? If you go ahead and if you make something hekdesh, you could have that vow annulled, or you could have that sanctity transferred in certain circumstances. The bechar, the hekdesh we're talking about is if you're using a bechar animal. Now, bechar animal says kidushasam erechem. Its sanctity again is in utero, and therefore it cannot be annulled. I have a hari nazir, but nazir could be annulled. And again, remember in the case of the Mishnah, plowing was taking place in a cemetery, and the guy in question was a kohen and a nazir. That sanctity could be annulled. But Nazir Shimshon. Shabbos said, this is actually interesting. If you remember back to our Nazir days, we had this. What is a Nazir Shimshon? A Nazir Shimshon is literally, again, a Nazir in utero, right? Shimshon was made a Nazir by the Malach Hashem while still inside of his mother. So a Nazir Shimshon, a Nazir Shimshon does not have revocation. That is an eternal status. Umar says, 1 second. Nazir Shimshon, bar itmuye lemeismu. Here's the issue. A Nazir Shimshon might be a status that remains forever, but there's no prohibition to become Tamei Meis. Right? Nazir Shimshon doesn't have Tumas Meis, or doesn't have a prohibition of Tumas Meis. And yet in our Mishnah, clearly again, one of the liabilities is coming from the fact that he's going into a cemetery. Elahai Tana Isser Kolal Leslie. Rather, I will say this Tana does not go ahead and get involved in what we call an Isser Kolal. So I will say, remember again, Isser Kolal refers to a person makes a shvuah that I won't go ahead and plow on the weekday on Yom Tov. So the logic is, since it goes ahead and applies to weekday, it also devolves upon Yom Tov. Our Tana does not subscribe to that notion. Okay, say for Rabbi, again, the point of the Gemara is just, what's the takeaway from all of this? What's the takeaway? Takeaway just is, even though the Mishnah said 8, and usually when a Mishnah says a number, usually what's the role of a number? What's the role of a number? To say this and no more. That doesn't apply over here. And halacha l'maisa, again, if you want to construct a case of even additional levels of liability, you could potentially do that in this scenario over here. Okay, the Gemara ends off by saying the following: Amar Oshia, Hamarbia sharp sulei mukdashin lo keshnayim. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. So Rabbi Oshia says, if you go ahead and you breed a sharp sulei hamukdashin. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Hamarbia sharp sulei mukdashin. First wide line, shenifta Afilu amino loke. So Rabbi say, so if you have, for example, let's say you have an animal that was a carbon. The animal became disqualified for whatever reason. Right? For whatever reason. So the halacha is now, you could redeem that animal. Animal developed the mum. You could redeem that animal. Now, Rabbi said that there's an interesting halacha when it comes to a redeemed carbonic animal. It still retains some of its sanctity. So, for example, you could shecht it and eat it, but let's say, for example, you can't use it for its shearing. So you're allowed to use it in certain ways, not allowed to use it in other ways. Because of that, a redeemed carbonic animal is looked at in halacha as almost having two different identities in one. It's looked at as two animals in one animal. It's, on one hand, it's hegdish, and on the other hand, it's chol. Go back to Rashi. Rashi says over here again, Shenifte afilu amino loke shari guf echad v'asal hakasav shnei gufin. Even though it's one animal, it's almost as if it's really two animals in one. The Torah schulin, the Torah kachim yesh alav. On one hand, it's a chulin animal, and on the other hand, it's a kodesh animal. Torah schulin shemuter ba'achila, right, michutz lepesach o moed, kilu lo hoktash me'olam. So on one hand, it's chulin. Why is it chulin? You could shecht it and you could eat it. And where can you shecht it? Where can you eat it? Anywhere you want. Anywhere you want. On the other hand, the Torah's kachim sha'asar begiza va'avoda. On the other hand, it still retains some of its carbonic sanctity. In that, you can't shear it and you can't use it for work. So we'll say, so skip down a little bit in Rashi. Right, Hilchach, last three lines of that Rashi. Hilchach, asr laharbio afilamino. So we'll say, listen to this. So therefore, if you have a short psula mikdasha, so again, let me just frame this case because it's actually really quite interesting. So I have an animal that was set aside as a carbon. The animal developed a mum. As a result, I had to redeem it. What the Gemara is pointing out over here is this animal has a dual identity. On one hand, it's still considered hektish, so you can't work it, you can't shear it. On the other hand, it's considered to be chulin, because what can I do? I can eat it. This animal, therefore, is considered to be two animals in one. Therefore, if you mate this animal with another animal, it's kilayim, even if it's the same species of animal, right? Why? Because this animal is considered to have this dual identity, and therefore, again, if you mate it, well, you can't mate it with a hektish animal, because that's Yusuf hektish, but even if you mate it with a chulin animal, that's considered to be the mating of two dissimilar species. Now, the chiddush over here is that two different statuses are the equivalent of mating two different species, which is interesting. So finish up that Rashi. So Rashi says over here, therefore you can't mate it even with its own species. Mishum kilayim shemar bia chulin al kachim or kachim al chulin. So it says that's the halacha. That's the halacha. You can't go ahead and make so sharp psulim mikdashin. You can eat it, but you can't work it because, right, or you can't shear it because it's hektish, and you can't mate it with anything else because that's kilayim. Back to the Gemara for just a moment. We're not finishing Rashi yet. Similarly, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Hamanig b'shar psulam mikdashin loke shari guf echadu v'asal hakasav kishnei gufin. So too, I will say, so too, you can't even lead your plow, right? You can't even plow with that animal. Not only can you not go ahead and, not only can you not plow with that animal with another animal, right? You can't hitch another because that's kilayim. You can't even plow with the sharp suli hamukdashin itself. Well, firstly, you can't do it because you're not allowed to work that animal, but even if you were to do it, that would be tantamount to what? Plowing with two different animals. Essentially, Rabbi, a sharp suli hamukdashin, a redeemed, disqualified carbonic animal, has a dual identity. So because that, the Gemara says, number one, you can't mate it with any other animal, as that is called kilayim because of the dual identity, and you can't even use that animal to pull your plow by itself, because that animal is the equivalent of two animals. And therefore, using that animal to go in and pull your plow, ultimately, again, will be an issue of kilayim as well. That's how Rashi ends off. He says, "V'chein hamanig afilu manig imino v'afilu manigo b'fnei atzmo." That's why even if you put the same type of species under the plow with that animal, or you lead that animal itself, it's still kilayim. He says, "Chulim v'kachimu v'chayim mishum kilayim v'charishu." So we'll say, so bottom line, what's the takeaway from this? The takeaway is that a sharp psulim mikdashin, a disqualified carbonic animal, has a dual identity. Because it has a dual identity, therefore you can't use it to pull your plow. Again, you can't use it to pull your plow anyway, because you're not allowed to use that animal for work. But if you were to use it to pull your plow, not only would you be engaging in illegal use of consecrated item, but it would also be kilayim. And if you try to mate it, even with its own species, also called kilayim. I will say this is one of the most inspirationally beautiful Gemaras one could come across. Why? I will say, because remember, I will say, if a shar, right, a shar has this dual identity. When you hear this, what does it remind you of? What does it remind you of? It reminds you of yourself, right? Don't you see yourself in this shar psuli hamukdashim? This shar, on one hand, I will say, on one hand, it was Kodesh Kadashim, right? Just a day ago, where was it? Where was it? Just a day ago, it was inside the Beis HaMikdash, ready to go, fantastic, inspired, ready to fulfill its shlichus, ready to do what it's supposed to. And then what happened? What happened? What happened? It developed a mum. And what happens with that mum? What happens with that mum? That mum casts it out of the Beis HaMikdash. That mum removes it from the Mizbeach. And now it's kind of just walking around outside, right? Feeling all dejected, right? Feeling like an abysmal carbonic failure. And then what happens? Maseches Makkos Daf Chav Beis comes along, and what does it say to the shar? What does it say to the shar? Sharla, don't worry. Don't worry. You're still Kodesh. You're still Kodesh, right? There's still Kedusha inside of you. Okay, you're not the same as what you once were. But lest you think for a moment that mum totally divests you of your Kedusha, there could be nothing further from the truth. Once Kodesh, always Kodesh. Once holy, always holy. No matter what the mum is, it can never fully remove your Kodesh, your hektish status from inside. And I will say, what an inspiring and life-affirming Gemara. Because I will say, how many of us have had those beautiful moments where like, yes, I'm doing exactly what I need to do, how I need to do it. I'm in the proverbial Beis HaMikdash. I'm by the Mizbeach. I'm fulfilling my shlichus. And then what happens? Don't look at me blankly. You know exactly what happens, right? What happens is you develop a mum. I make a mistake. I make a wrong turn. I do something I'm not supposed to do, right? I indulge something I'm not supposed to indulge. And suddenly again, I'm like thrown out. I'm cast out. Suddenly all of that growth comes crashing down. Suddenly all of that beautiful movement and all of that beautiful Kedusha seems to have dissipated. And I'm just walking around aimlessly in life, looking from the outside in longingly at that beautiful Beis HaMikdash of personalistic spiritual accomplishment. And I feel so forlorn, and I feel so rejected, and I feel so empty. And the Gemara comes along and says, you're not. You might be a sharp psuli hamukdashin. The moment in life, the mistakes of life compromise us. And yes, when we make mistakes, we distance ourselves from our personalistic spiritual goals, from our personalistic mikdash. But lest you think that your mum robs you of all of your kedusha, lest you think that with every mum you're back to starting to square one as an empty vessel, there's nothing further from the truth. Even the sharp psuli hamukdashin, even after it develops its mum, still retains its residual kedusha. And if that's true for a shar, an ox, an animal, then alachas kama v'kama. Even when we develop our mumin in life, how much we retain our residual kedusha as well. What an inspirational and overwhelmingly beautiful Gemara to be mechazik us as we recover from our mumin in life. There's one big difference. What's the big difference? What's the biggest difference? The shar, once it has a mum, Rabbi say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Once it has a mum, it's done. Hol v'nidcha, nidcha. The way it works by karbanos is, once you develop a mum and you're out, you are out. Herein lies the greatest distinction between man and shar. I develop a mum, and while I have that mum, all right, so I'm outside of the mikdash. But even when I'm outside of the mikdash, I still retain my kedusha. But I can heal. I can regenerate. I can fix my mumin and get right back into the mikdash of personalistic accomplishment. Incredible. Mishnah. Kama Malkin also. We've been waiting for this Mishnah the whole time. Right? Makkos. All about Makkos. Now I want to say, let's get into Makkos. Whoever thought it could be so exciting. Ketzal Malkin also. Arboim chasrachas. Shneimar mispar arboim. Min yushu samach arboim. I was supposed to say, how many Makkos do you get? What's the maximum number? 39. But the Torah says 40. Torah says 40. So the Torah says, b'mispar arboim, a number like 40, which means a number close to 40, but not 40 itself, 39. So 39 is the maximum number of malchus that a person could go ahead and get. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, arboim shel musolgo. Not true, not true. You get 40 malchus. Fine. So we'll see that machlokes in the Gemara just a little bit. So Rabbi says, so by the way, is hayisera. Now we'll say we're going to see Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama both agree with where you get malchus. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a 40th. According to Tanakama, there's no 40th. Rabbi Yehuda, where do you get that 40th lash, right? Where does that go? Bank safe up. Ultimately, again, it goes between the shoulders. Again, we'll talk more about that in the Gemara. First of all, I will say, when assessing the number of Makkos, you only get a number divisible by 3. Right? Always a number divisible by 3. Okay, we'll see why that is. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. I'm doing the Kabbalah Arbaim, Veloke Mixas. So it says, let's say again, Reuven wore shatnez. Right? So now he's getting Malchus, and originally we said he is capable. And Abba said they had a court doctor. There's a court physician, a Beis physician. So they did his physical. They assessed he is able to withstand 40 Malchus or 39 Malchus. And what happens? On the base, now what ended up happening? Now what ends up happening is, let's say like this. Let's say originally they said he can get 40. And then it turns out, and then it turns out that halacha l'maaseh they assessed that he can't go ahead and get the full 40. We stop. Putter. He gets what he gets, and that's it. Now look at Rashi. Top Rashi Chabez Mabeza. Andu Shen Yachal Lekabel Pater. Techeben is Baz Bebeis Din Veloka Ktsas Sagile Bahaki. Avalo Loka Elamdu La Arboim Bechazru VaAndu Shen Yachal Lekabel Kulam Kulam Lo Miftar Dein Rashan Ligra Omid Elaloke Achar Zman. VaAchinami Mamdu Akis. So we'll say so. The Mishnah is interesting halacha. Let's say Beis Din decided Reuven could get 39 Malchus. They start lashing him. He has a negative reaction to the lashes. He can't take any more. Gemara essentially says that's okay. We stop, and whatever he got, and we don't make him get the rest. That's the halacha. Okay. Amdua lekabel shmona esrei umishalaka amdu shiyachu lekabel arboim pater. Similarly, let's say they assessed that he's only capable of getting 18 Malchus. And then what happens? As they start flogging him, like, hey, this guy holds up well, right? He is capable, right? He is capable, much more durable than we thought. He's capable of getting more Malchus. We don't do that. In other words, whatever the initial assessment was, that's what we stick to. But the chiddush over here is that if he had initial assessment, then once we start the flogging, they recognize that he can't maintain that. We don't go ahead. We give him what he got, and that's it. And that's it. Now, Rashi points out, let's see the Gemara. So let's see the Gemara. My timer. So we'll say, so first of all, we have a major machlokes over here. Machlokes in Tanakama and Rabbi Huda. How many malchus do you actually get? Tanakama says 39. Rabbi Huda says 40. So what's the machlokes over here? My timer. Now the truth is, there's not a kasha on Rabbi Huda, because the pasuk says, Arboim yakenu. The pasuk says 40, right? 40. So Rabbi Huda is not a shayla. The shayla is on the Tanakama. Ultimately, again, why did they get? Why did they say 39? So my timer. So the Gemara says, Iksiv arboim b'mispar havamina arboim b'minyana. So again, if the pasuk would have said arboim b'mispar, 40 in number, I would have said that means 40 lashes. So the Gemara says, Hashta d'chsiv b'mispar arboim. But it's interesting, the pasuk uses a different lashon. The lashon of the pasuk is b'mispar arboim, in a number of 40, which sounds like what? Minyan shu soke mes arboim, a sum, a number that is close to 40. Mes arboim means like a number close to 40. Therefore, again, Chazal interprets that as, or Tanakama interprets that as 39. Okay? And both say that's how we paskin, right? We paskin 39 malchus, not 40. Amar Rava, so both says it's a beautiful Gemara. Amar Rava says, Kama tipshai shar inshi. How foolish people are. Tikaimi mikame sefer Torah. They stand up for a sefer Torah. V'lo kaimi mikame gavra rabba. But they don't stand up for talmidei chachamim. Why? What's the pshat? It's incredible. Dilu b'sefer Torah k'sev arboim. Because in the sefer Torah it says you get 40 malchus. V'asu rabbanon batzu chada. And the rabbis came along and saved you from one of the lashes. So we'll say, so what does this mean? So Rabbi says, you see how great Chazal are. People stand up for a Sefer Torah, but people don't stand up for a Talmid Chacham. According to the Torah, you get 40 malchus, but Chazal came along and interpreted and say 30 malchus. So we'll say, what's the pshat? I think what Rabbi is saying is like this. And I will say, a lot of times we look at rabbinic law, as an additional layer of onerous responsibility, right? And it goes through our minds, right? I think everyone's had this thought at some point in time in the evolution of their Judaic personality is, don't the rabbis have better things to do at their time than add on additional layers of prohibition, right? Come on, Torah is complicated enough, halacha is complicated enough, why do you need all these things? I will say it is so important to understand that the whole notion of rabbinic law is there to save us, is there to help us, is there to actually facilitate our self-actualization. Yes, sometimes by adding on additional protective layers so that we don't make egregious mistakes that could compromise our spiritual standing. But rabbinic law is never there to make life more difficult. Fakert. Rabbinic law, without rabbinic law, we would be lost. Without Chazal's interpretations, we would be lost. Chazal ultimately, again, provide us the lifeline to ensure that we are successful in our Yiddishkeit, not to make things more complicated, chas v'shalom, but to go ahead and, Emir Hashem, hopefully, make our Yiddishkeit more accessible and make it easier to succeed. So therefore, it's most manifest over here. Torah says, you get 40 Makkos. Chazal came along and removed a lash. Removed the lash. Now, you'll say to yourself, oh, shkoyach, remove the lash. Now, by the way, if you're the guy getting flogged, I guarantee you, when they get up to 38, and you realize there's only one more and not two more, you are singing the praises of Chazal. Right? But again, what this is supposed to represent, this idea that the same over here, they actively removed an obstacle, so to speak. They actively removed a lash. This is what Chazal do all of the time. They remove stumbling blocks. They remove difficulties. We look at it as onerous, additional layers of nonsensical things. It's not true. It's because we are limited in our understanding, or we are limited in our appreciation. But if we understood what Chazal truly did for us, our appreciation of Talmidei Chachamim, our appreciation of Chazal, our appreciation of Torah Sheba'al Peh, our appreciation of the Tanam and Amoraim would skyrocket, because they are there only to help us, only to facilitate our growth, and never chas v'shalom to add on additional difficult layers. So beautiful. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Arbaim Shlemos. I'm Rabbi Yitzchak. My time is Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Rabbi Yehuda is pretty intuitive. Dichsev, Maha Makkos Ha'ila Biyadecha. Bein Yadecha. So the Gemara is asking over here, not as much why does Rabbi Yehuda hold that Allah Chalmaisa there's 40. 40 is intuitive. He's asking, interestingly enough, what about that 40th lash, right? Rabbi Yehuda says it goes between the shoulders. Ultimately, again, what's the pshat? What's the pshat with that? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda bases on this pasuk. The Gemara quotes this pasuk from Zechariah. Ma Makkos ha'ila ben yadecha. What are these Makkos? Ben yadecha means between your shoulders. So it's va'amar asheri kesi beis ma'avai. I have been flogged or I've been hit by my loved one. So it's very beautiful over here. It's understanding that even the lashes that come about in Beis Din are there for what purpose? Are there for love? Are there for instruction? So again, Rabbi Yehuda is bringing this as a logic. He's talking about a lash that's done between the shoulders. Now let's say we're going to see in general, was in the next Mishnah, lashes were not really done between the shoulders, right? So what's that lash between the shoulders? That must be the 40th one, right? That must be that additional lash. Okay, the Rabbanan says, no, what is this pasuk referring to? Ultimately, again, that's actually talking about the flogging of kids. Okay, let's put that in context for a little bit. So again, obviously, we've seen this right from the Gemara. There was a different code of discipline, So physical discipline, right? Physical discipline was clearly very accepted. So that lash that they're referring to, that's the lash that the Rebbe would give to the Talmidim, ultimately, again, to keep them in line. Now that additional lash, okay, it's not referring to Makkos itself. Fine. So the Gemara says, so remember again. So interestingly enough, the halacha is, right, the Mishnah said that we assess how much a person could take, lash-wise, right? How much a person could take. So the Gemara said, right, I'm doing the Kabbalah Barim below mix. So remember, the Mishnah then had two cases. Case number one is we assessed that Reuven could get 40 Makkos, or 39 Makkos. And then we started, and then ultimately he couldn't withstand anymore. We stop and we say, okay, you've received your punishment, we're done. So the Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says, lock it in, lo lock alone. How about say, okay, so let me at least start with this, and then we'll probably pick up with this tomorrow. Let's play this out. Reuven was subject to 39 Makkos, right? We assessed him, perfectly healthy male, non-smoker between the ages of 20 and 60, right? So he's capable of going ahead and getting 39 Makkos. We start flogging him, and what happens? He goes ahead and he starts to buckle. We're 18 in. So there are two approaches we could do over here. What's right? Approach number one. What's approach number one? What's the more intuitive approach? Right? Take a break. Right, take a break. Right, let's break for a few. Right, go get some lunch. Right, come back and let's resume this flogging later on. Right. In other words, that would be the best idea. Or tomorrow, or the next day. Take a long weekend. Come back afterwards. Right, we'll flog you on Monday. Right. In other words, that would have been the logic. You're liable to this. Right. The same way, by the way, if I steal and let's say again I stole $1,000, I only have $100 to repay. Fine, repay the $100. Then what happens to the remaining $900? It's a debt. So too, I could say Makkos is a debt as well. You can't pay it now. We'll flog you later on. Interesting enough, that's not what the Mishnah says. What the Mishnah says is instead, we'll flog you, and since you can't take any more, we're done. So we're going to stop here for today. So we'll pick up Mishnah with this Gemara tomorrow, but this is quite interesting. So we're going to see there are times where you have to make up the Makkos, and times where you simply are, quote unquote, yotze with what you've received. When we apply each of those, all right, Chavran Zoom. Have a good day, everyone.